Touch the wall of your home, feel its solidity. The roof over your head, the floor beneath your feet. We build as if our structures will last forever. 8,200 years ago, people felt exactly the same way, and then the climate broke. They had built villages that stood for generations. They had planted fields that fed their children and their children's children. They had created communities with traditions stretching back centuries. And then it all came apart. We call it the 8.2 kiloyear event, a sudden catastrophic climate shift that lasted centuries. Temperatures plummeted, rains failed, rivers that had flowed for generations dried to dust, and civilizations that had flourished for 1,000 years simply vanished. The name sounds clinical, 8.2 kiloyear. Just a number marking years before present, but behind that number lies one of the most dramatic climate catastrophes in human history. This was not a gradual change that people could adapt to. Ice core records show the temperature dropped within a single decade, perhaps within a single year. One generation knew abundance, the next knew only survival. Scientists can read the crisis in layers of ancient ice. In Greenland, the annual snowfall is compressed into distinct bands, each one a record of that year's conditions. The 8.2 kiloyear event shows up as a sudden stark line. If you are watching this to fall asleep tonight, that is perfect. This catastrophe happened 8,000 years ago. The mystery of what it destroyed will still be here when you wake up. Subscribe and stick around. To understand what was lost, you need to know what existed before. 8,500 years ago, the world was entering a golden age. The Ice Age had ended. Temperatures were warm. Rainfall was abundant. Humanity was thriving in this warm, wet world. Populations were growing. New technologies were spreading. The possibilities seemed endless. No one could have known how quickly it would change. This period is called the Holocene climatic optimum, a time when temperatures were slightly warmer than today, when rainfall was more generous in many regions, when the conditions for human expansion were nearly ideal. It was a world of abundance. Forests stretched where deserts now lie. Rivers flowed through landscapes that are now parched. Wildlife thrived in numbers we can barely imagine today. The Sahara was green, not just at its edges, but throughout. Lakes dotted what is now barren desert. Hippos swam where sand dunes stand today. Giraffes grazed where nothing now survives. The transformation from green to desert would take thousands of years to complete. But the 8.2 kiloyear event accelerated the process dramatically. What had been gradual became sudden. Lake Megachad was the largest freshwater lake on Earth. It covered an area the size of the modern Caspian Sea. Fish swam in its waters. Villages lined its shores. Today, only a fraction of that lake remains. The people who lived around Lake Megachad had developed sophisticated fishing cultures. They built boats, they traded across the lake. They created art that still survives in the rock paintings of the Sahara. When the lake began to shrink, these people had to choose: stay and watch their world disappear, or move to find water elsewhere. Most chose to move. The lake cultures dispersed. Rock art from this period shows people swimming, fishing, hunting abundant game. The Sahara was not a barrier between peoples, but a highway. Trade routes crossed what would become the world's largest desert. These images are haunting. They show a world that no longer exists. Children playing in water where now there is only sand. Animals grazing where nothing grows. A paradise that became a desert. In the Fertile Crescent, agriculture had been established for over 2,000 years. Villages had become towns. Towns were becoming something more. The first experiments in civilization were underway. Fatal Feyfek in modern Turkey held perhaps 8,000 people. They lived in houses built wall to wall, entering through holes in the roof. They made art. They traded obsidian. They buried their dead beneath their floors. Wall paintings decorated their homes, scenes of hunting, geometric patterns, images of leopards and bulls and strange humanoid figures. Whatever beliefs drove these images, they were important enough to paint on the walls. People saw every day. The obsidian they traded came from volcanoes 100 kilometers away. Someone was making that journey regularly. Trade networks existed before cities, before writing, before everything we associate with civilization. Fatal Feyfek had existed for over 1,000 years when the climate crisis struck. 1,000 years of continuous occupation, longer than the time from the Norman conquest to today, a success story by any measure. Jericho had walls and a tower, not for defense, some archaeologists argue, but for flood control and as symbols of community power. People were learning to build on scales their ancestors could not have imagined. The tower still stands, 8 meters tall, built over 10,000 years ago. Whatever its purpose, it required organized labor, planning, leadership, surplus food, to feed workers who were not farming. Along the coasts of the Levant, fishing communities thrived. The Mediterranean provided reliable food. Settlements grew permanent. Children grew up, never knowing the nomadic life their great-grandparents had lived. These coastal people were connected by boats. Trade moved along the shore. Obsidian from Anatolia reached Cyprus by sea. Shells from the coast traveled inland for hundreds of kilometers. In the Zagros Mountains of Iran, people were domesticating goats and sheep. In China, rice cultivation was beginning along the Yangtze. In the Americas, squash and early crops were being tended. Around the world, humans were settling down. This was the Neolithic revolution spreading across the globe. The transformation from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. The change that would eventually create cities, writing, and everything we call civilization. And then it stopped. In some places, it reversed. The 8.2 kiloyear event struck like a hammer blow to a world that was just learning to build. No one saw it coming. No one could have predicted it. The ice dam breaking in North America was invisible to the farmers of the Near East. They only knew that the world was changing. The cause was water. Too much of it in the wrong place, at the wrong time. As the last glaciers of the Ice Age melted, they had been filling enormous lakes in North America, lakes larger than all the Great Lakes combined. Lake Agassiz covered parts of what is now Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Minnesota, and North Dakota. At its peak, It held more water than all the lakes on Earth today. An inland sea created by melting ice, Lake Ojibwe sat beside it. Equally vast together, these two lakes represented an almost unimaginable volume of fresh water. Trillions upon trillions of gallons waiting. Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe sat behind dams of ice. For thousands of years, the ice held. The lakes grew larger, the pressure built. And then, around 8,200 years ago, the dam broke. The breach happened somewhere near Hudson Bay. The ice that had blocked the waters for millennia finally gave way, and the lakes began to drain into the North Atlantic Ocean. The flood was beyond imagination. Trillions of gallons of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. Enough water to raise global sea levels measurably. Enough water to change the chemistry of an ocean. The drainage may have happened over days or weeks, or it may have taken decades. Scientists debate the timing, but the effect on ocean circulation was dramatic and rapid. Fresh water is lighter than salt water. It floats on top. The floodwaters spread across the surface of the North Atlantic, forming a layer that disrupted the deep ocean currents that regulate global climate. The Atlantic thermohaline circulation is like a giant conveyor belt. Warm water flows north from the tropics, warming Europe. As it reaches high latitudes, it cools and becomes denser, sinking to the ocean floor. The cold, dense water then flows south along the ocean bottom, eventually rising again in the tropics to be warmed once more. This cycle moves heat from the equator toward the poles, moderating global climate. When fresh water flooded the North Atlantic, it broke the conveyor belt. The warm water stopped flowing north. The sinking mechanism failed. The cycle that had kept Europe warm for millennia slowed or stopped entirely. The effects were immediate and devastating. Temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by 1 to 5 degrees Celsius. In some regions, average temperatures fell by as much as 8 degrees. To understand what this means, consider that the entire Ice Age was only about 5 degrees colder than today. A drop of several degrees in a single decade would have been catastrophic for societies adapted to specific conditions. Growing seasons shortened. Crops that had thrived for generations now struggled or failed. Animals migrated or died. The ecological zones that humans had adapted to shifted faster than people could follow. The cold spread far beyond Europe. Climate systems are interconnected. When the North Atlantic cooled, it affected weather patterns across the globe. The monsoons that watered Asia and Africa weakened. The African and Asian monsoons depend on temperature differences between land and ocean. When those differences changed, the monsoons faltered. Rains that had come reliably for millennia became erratic or failed entirely. In the Fertile Crescent, rainfall dropped dramatically. The rivers that had sustained agriculture for generations carried less water. Springs dried up. Wells went empty. The land that had fed growing populations could no longer support them. The Tigris and Euphrates still flowed, fed by mountain snowmelt. But their tributaries shrank. The seasonal floods that deposited fertile soil became unpredictable. Farmers who had relied on the rhythm of the rivers found that rhythm broken. The Green Sahara began to die. Lake levels dropped. The hippos and crocodiles that had lived in Saharan lakes found their homes shrinking and eventually disappearing. Grasslands turned to scrub. Scrub turned to sand. The animals that had sustained human populations for millennia moved away or perished. The land that had supported tens of thousands of people became uninhabitable. The rock art tells the story. Early images show giraffes, elephants, hippos, abundant wildlife. Later images show cattle as people tried to adapt. Finally, the art stops. The artists had gone. Archaeological sites tell the story of abandonment. In Turkey, settlements that had been occupied for centuries were suddenly left empty. In Cyprus, entire communities disappeared. In the Levant, population collapsed. Fatal Fake was abandoned around this time. The great proto-city that had housed thousands of people for over a millennium was left to the dust. The reasons are debated, but the timing is suggestive. The final layers of occupation show changes. The careful artistry of earlier centuries disappears. The houses are less well maintained. Something had gone wrong before the final abandonment. Did the rains fail? Did the springs that had fed the settlement for 1,000 years dry up? Did conflict with neighbors increase as resources shrank? We can only speculate. What we know is that people left. After more than 1,000 years of continuous occupation, they walked away, perhaps to the coast, perhaps to the mountains, perhaps to their deaths, we do not know. Other sites show similar patterns. Ain Ghazal in Jordan, once a thriving Neolithic town of thousands, shrank dramatically during this period. Its population declined by 90%. The regional effects varied. Some areas were hit harder than others. The eastern Mediterranean seems to have suffered severely. Cyprus shows dramatic population decline. Coastal settlements were abandoned. In Europe, the effects were different. The cooling made conditions challenging, but also made some areas more attractive to incoming farmers, fleeing worse conditions in the east. The timing of the Neolithic spread into Central and Northern Europe matches the crisis period. Farmers were on the move, bringing their crops and animals to new territories. Crisis drove expansion. In Africa, the effects were devastating. The Sahara was drying anyway, but the 8.2 kiloyear event accelerated the process. What had been gradual became sudden. Lakes that had lasted millennia disappeared within generations. The people who had lived around those lakes had to move. Some went north to the Mediterranean coast. Some went south toward wetter regions. Some concentrated along the Nile. The Nile corridor became a highway of refugees. People from the drying west, people from the deteriorating north, people from everywhere, crowding into the one reliable water source. In Asia, the weakened monsoons affected millions. The Indus Valley civilization would not emerge for another 2,000 years. But its foundations were being laid by populations adapting to new conditions. China's early agricultural communities faced their own challenges. Rice cultivation along the Yangtze continued, but patterns changed. Sites were abandoned. New sites were established. Some archaeologists believe this crisis drove the spread of farming into Europe. As conditions deteriorated in the Near East, farming communities pushed into new territories, bringing their crops and animals with them. The timing is suggestive. Before the 8.2 kiloyear event, farming was largely confined to the Near East and Anatolia. After the event, it spread rapidly through the Balkans and into Central Europe. The Sarajevo culture of the Balkans expanded during this period. Farming communities established themselves in the Danube Valley, then pushed further north and west. The expansion was remarkably rapid. The spread was not peaceful exploration, but desperate flight. Whole communities packing up what they could carry and moving to new lands, bringing their seeds, their animals, their knowledge. They brought wheat and barley, crops domesticated thousands of years earlier in the Fertile Crescent. They brought sheep and goats, animals adapted to Near Eastern conditions. They brought pottery traditions and burial customs. The people already living in Europe were hunter-gatherers. They had lived there for thousands of years. Now they faced an influx of refugees carrying a completely different way of life. The encounter was not simple. In some areas, farming spread faster than the farmers themselves, suggesting technology transfer to local populations. In others, genetic replacement suggests displacement. What happened when these groups met is still debated. Some areas show signs of conflict, others show gradual integration. The genetic evidence suggests intermarriage, but also replacement. In some regions, the hunter-gatherer populations largely disappeared within a few generations. Their genes were absorbed into the farming population, but their way of life ended. In other regions, integration was more gradual. Hunter-gatherers adopted farming techniques. Farmers learned local knowledge. The boundary between groups blurred over centuries. Within a few centuries, farming had spread across most of Europe. A way of life that had been confined to the Near East for millennia suddenly expanded rapidly. Climate crisis may have been the push. In Africa, the drying Sahara forced people to concentrate around remaining water sources. The Nile Valley became increasingly important. Populations that had been spread across a green landscape now crowded along the river. The refugees brought different traditions, different technologies, different ideas. The mixing of populations along the Nile may have stimulated innovation. Diversity can drive creativity when survival is at stake. The Nile was different from other rivers. It flooded predictably, fertilizing the land with rich silt. Even as the Sahara dried, the Nile kept flowing, fed by rains in the Ethiopian highlands. The reliability of the Nile made Egypt possible, a river that could be counted on, a flood that came every year without fail, a foundation upon which civilization could be built. Some scholars see in this concentration the seeds of Egyptian civilization. When the Sahara was green, there was no need for the intense organization that later characterized Egypt. When it dried, cooperation became necessary for survival. Managing the Nile floods required coordination. Building irrigation channels required organized labor. Storing surplus grain required administration. The river that saved them also demanded that they organize. The same pattern may have occurred in Mesopotamia. As climate deteriorated, populations concentrated along the Tigris and Euphrates. The need to manage increasingly scarce water may have driven the development of irrigation and administration. The rivers of Mesopotamia were less predictable than the Nile. They flooded at the wrong time for planting. Their courses shifted. Managing them required engineering and planning that simpler societies had never needed. Who would organize the labor? Who would decide which fields got water first? Who would store the surplus and distribute it fairly? These questions drove the development of hierarchy, bureaucracy, and eventually kingship. This is a controversial interpretation. Not all scholars agree that climate crisis drove civilization, but the timing is striking. The first complex societies emerged in the centuries after the 8.2 kiloyear event. The cold period lasted somewhere between 150 and 400 years, depending on location, long enough for multiple generations to live and die, knowing only crisis, long enough to transform cultures completely, 400 years. Imagine the American Revolution happening before the crisis ended. Everyone who lived through the beginning would be dead before the end. Their great-great-great-grandchildren would still be coping with the consequences. Imagine being born into that world. Your grandparents tell stories of abundance that seem like myths, rivers that flowed year, round rains that came when expected, harvests that filled the granaries. You have never seen those rivers. You have never known reliable rain. The stories seem impossible. How could anyone have lived so well? The old ones must be exaggerating. You know, only drought, failed crops, migration, competition for shrinking resources. The stories of the past seem impossible. How could anyone have lived so well? And yet people survived. They adapted, they moved, they changed their ways of living to match new conditions. Human resilience showed itself even in catastrophe. Some innovations may have emerged from crisis. Pottery styles changed rapidly during this period. New forms appeared, old forms disappeared. Necessity drove invention as people searched for better ways to store food and water. Settlement patterns shifted. Hilltop sites became more common. Defensible positions mattered more when resources were scarce and competition was fierce. The landscape of human habitation changed. Social organization evolved. In some areas, evidence suggests increasing hierarchy. Leaders who could organize survival had power. Those who could not were replaced or absorbed by those who could. The 8.2 kiloyear event was not the first climate crisis humans faced. The Younger Dryas 10,000 years earlier had been worse. But this time, humans had more to lose. During the Younger Dryas, humans were still mostly hunter-gatherers. They could move. They could follow the animals. They could adapt by shifting their range. By 8,200 years ago, many populations were tied to specific places. Their fields, their irrigation channels, their permanent settlements. Moving meant abandoning everything they had built. This is the trap of civilization. The same investments that create prosperity also create vulnerability. The more you build, the more you have to lose. The harder it becomes to simply walk away. Some communities found solutions. They built cisterns to store water during dry periods. They developed drought-resistant crops through selection. They established trade networks to buffer local shortages. The cisterns from this period are remarkable. deep pits lined with plaster to hold water. Technology developed under pressure, preserving the life, giving liquid through months of drought. Trade networks became lifelines. If your crops failed, perhaps you could trade crafts or obsidian for food from regions less affected. Interdependence increased as a survival strategy. Others could not adapt quickly enough. Their settlements were abandoned, their populations scattered, their innovations and knowledge were lost or absorbed by others. The archaeological record from this period is fragmentary. We see the gaps, the abandonments, the sudden changes, but we can only guess at the human stories behind the material evidence. Every abandoned site represents families making terrible decisions. Stay and hope the rains return, or leave everything you know and search for something better. How many people died? We do not know. Climate catastrophe does not kill directly like warfare. It kills through starvation, through disease that follows malnutrition, through conflicts over scarce resources. Children are the most vulnerable. When food runs short, adults survive while children fail to thrive. The demographic impact would have been severe, even for communities that survived as groups. The old were vulnerable too. When every calorie matters, those who cannot contribute become burdens. Traditional respect for elders may have weakened under survival pressure. The survivors carry the legacy. Every person alive today is descended from those who made it through. Whatever genes, whatever cultural knowledge helped people survive, we inherited them. Eventually, the crisis ended. The North Atlantic circulation recovered. Temperatures stabilized. Rainfall patterns returned closer to normal. The world began to heal. The recovery was not instant. Ecosystems that had been damaged needed time to rebuild. Populations that had collapsed needed generations to recover. But the worst was over. But the world that emerged was different from the one that had existed before. Populations had shifted. Cultures had transformed. The Sahara was on its way to becoming the desert we know today. The Green Sahara would linger in patches for another 2,000 years before the final desiccation. But the 8.2 kiloyear event accelerated a drying that was already underway. In the Near East, populations had reorganized around water sources. The foundations were being laid for what would become the first true cities. Uruk, the great civilizations of Mesopotamia. The pattern is striking. Crisis concentrates populations. Concentrated populations require organization. Organization creates hierarchy. Hierarchy creates civilization. From disaster comes complexity. This is not a comfortable theory. It suggests that the civilizations we celebrate arose from catastrophe, that the structures we live within today have their origins in survival strategies from 8,000 years ago. But the evidence is suggestive. Time and again in human history, environmental stress has driven social change. People who might have lived separately are forced together. New forms of organization emerge. The 8.2 kiloyear event left traces that scientists can still read. Ice cores from Greenland show the sudden temperature drop. Cave formations record changes in rainfall. tree rings mark years of drought. The ice cores are remarkable. Annual layers of snow compressed into ice preserve a record of ancient climate. Oxygen isotopes reveal temperature. Dust levels indicate atmospheric conditions. Trapped air bubbles contain samples of ancient atmosphere. Lake sediments from Africa show the drying. Pollen records from Europe show vegetation changes. The evidence is global and consistent. Something dramatic happened around 8,200 years ago. Speleothems. The formations in caves like stalactites and stalagmites grow in response to rainfall. Their chemical composition changes with climate. They provide yet another line of evidence for the 8.2 kiloyear event. Ocean sediments preserve tiny shells of organisms that lived in surface waters. The chemistry of these shells reflects the temperature and salinity of the water they grew in. The 8.2 kiloyear event shows up clearly. What is harder to read is the human response. Archaeology gives us snapshots, not movies. We see that a settlement was occupied, then abandoned. We see that populations moved, but the details remain hidden. The gap between the climate record and the human record is frustrating. We know the crisis happened. We can see its effects on the environment. But the human stories remain largely invisible. What we can piece together suggests massive disruption, site abandonments, population movements, cultural transformations. The evidence, incomplete as it is, points to a world turned upside down. Did people understand what was happening to them? Did they have explanations for why the rains stopped? Why the rivers shrank? Why the world they knew was ending? They would have had no concept of ocean circulation or glacial lake outbursts. They would have seen only the effects: failing crops, dying animals, changing seasons. The causes would have been invisible. Perhaps they blamed the gods. Perhaps they blamed themselves. Perhaps they simply endured, generation after generation, waiting for a change they could not predict and could not cause. But humans have always sought explanations. We are meaning-making creatures. Even without scientific knowledge, people would have developed theories about why their world was changing. Rituals may have intensified as people sought to appease whatever forces controlled their fate. New gods may have been invoked. New sacrifices may have been offered. We find evidence of changed ritual practices during this period. Burial customs shift, artifacts change. Whatever people believed before, they believed something different after. New symbols appear in the archaeological record, new forms of art. The crisis may have transformed not just how people lived, but how they thought about their existence. Some scholars have speculated about flood myths. Nearly every culture has a story of a great flood that destroyed the world. Could these stories preserve memory of the 8.2 kiloyear event? The Sumerian flood story predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years. It tells of divine anger, a chosen survivor, a boat, a new beginning. The pattern appears across cultures. The flood was real, even if it happened in the North Atlantic rather than the Near East. Its effects were global. The trauma could have been transmitted through oral tradition for thousands of years, or the myths might preserve memory of other floods entirely. Sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age flooded coastal settlements around the world. Local floods have always been part of human experience. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests that a catastrophic deluge filled what had been a freshwater lake. Communities living around its shores would have been devastated. Multiple floods may have contributed to multiple myths. The human memory of disaster is robust. Stories of survival against overwhelming water may blend many events into archetypal narratives. What we can say is that the 8.2 kiloyear event changed the course of human history, not by intention, not by plan, but by forcing people to adapt in ways that had lasting consequences. The spread of farming into Europe was accelerated. The concentration of populations along the Nile and in Mesopotamia was intensified. The stage was set for the emergence of the first cities. The first cities were strange places. Uruk in Mesopotamia held perhaps 40,000 people by 5,000 years ago. A density of population that had never existed before, a new way of being human. Cities required administration. Who would organize food distribution? Who would manage water rights? Who would settle disputes among strangers who shared no family ties? New institutions emerged to fill these needs. Writing emerged from these administrative needs. The earliest writing is not poetry or myth, but accounting lists of goods, records of transactions, the bureaucracy of surplus. Within 3,000 years of the event, Egypt had pharaohs and pyramids. Mesopotamia had writing and law codes. The Indus Valley had planned cities with plumbing. China had bronze and bureaucracy. Each of these civilizations developed independently in response to similar pressures. River valleys, concentrated populations, the need to manage water and food and people. Would these civilizations have emerged without the climate crisis, perhaps? But perhaps the crisis was necessary. Perhaps concentration and organization required a push that only disaster could provide. The irony is bitter. The civilizations we celebrate may owe their existence to catastrophe. The societies that gave us writing, mathematics, architecture, and law may have been born from survival strategies. And those civilizations, in turn, have created the conditions for new climate crises. The carbon we release into the atmosphere threatens to trigger another disruption of ocean circulation. The parallel is not exact. The 8.2 kiloyear event was caused by a sudden release of cold fresh water. Modern climate change involves gradual warming, but the mechanisms overlap. Scientists worry that the North Atlantic circulation could weaken again. Melting ice from Greenland is adding fresh water to the ocean, the same dynamic that caused the 8.2 kiloyear event is in play. The Greenland ice sheet holds enough water to raise global sea levels by 7 meters. It is not melting that fast yet, but it is melting faster than it was a decade ago. The trend is clear. We are not immune to the forces that shaped our ancestors. The ocean currents that our distant relatives disrupted by accident, we are disrupting by the accumulated effects of industrial civilization. The difference is knowledge. We understand what is happening in a way our ancestors could not. We can measure the changes. We can model the consequences. We know where this path leads. Climate models suggest that Atlantic circulation is already weakening, not as dramatically as during the 8.2 kiloyear event, but measurably, the conveyor belt is slowing. Whether that knowledge will translate into action is another question. The people 8,000 years ago had no choice. The catastrophe happened to them. We are choosing our path with open eyes. The 8.2 kiloyear event lasted centuries. Even after temperatures stabilized, the ecological and social effects persisted. Recovery takes far longer than collapse. The Sahara never recovered. What had been grassland and savanna became the desert we know today. The hippos and giraffes are gone. The lakes are empty basins of sand. This is what climate scientists call hysteresis. Some changes cannot be undone simply by reversing the cause. Once a system crosses certain thresholds, it settles into a new state. Ice sheets, once melted, take thousands of years to regrow. Ecosystems, once destroyed, may never return to their original state. Species, once extinct, are gone forever. The people who lived through the 8.2 kiloyear event left us more than ruins and artifacts. They left us a warning. Civilizations are fragile. Climate is powerful. Prosperity is not guaranteed. They also left us hope. Humans survived, adapted, built again. The crisis did not end humanity. It transformed it. What emerged from the catastrophe eventually became the world we live in. The same adaptability that got our ancestors through the crisis is still with us. We can change. We can innovate. We can cooperate when survival demands it. The capacity is part of our inheritance. If you have drifted off by now, that is perfect. This crisis ended 8,000 years ago. The warning it carries will still be here when you wake up. And if you are still awake, consider this. You are descended from survivors. Every ancestor in your line, going back 8,000 years and more, made it through. That resilience is your inheritance. Think about the odds. Out of all the people alive 8,200 years ago, only those who survived the crisis have descendants today. You carry their success in your very existence. The climate has always changed. Ice ages have come and gone. Droughts have dried the land and ended. Floods have swept away civilizations and receded. Through it all, humans have persisted. This is not an argument for complacency. The 8.2 kiloyear event killed untold numbers of people, destroyed communities, ended ways of life that had endured for millennia. The suffering was real. Parents watched children starve. Communities turned on each other. The trauma echoed through generations. Climate change is never abstract. It happens to actual people. But it is a reminder that catastrophe is not the end of the story. It is often the beginning of a new chapter. What grows from the ashes may be different from what came before, but it grows. The people of 8,000 years ago could not have imagined us. Our cities, our technologies, our numbers. They built for their survival, not for our admiration. They made choices that seemed necessary at the time. Move here, plant this, store that, cooperate with those people. Each decision made under pressure, with no knowledge of what would come, Yet here we are, their descendants, living in a world shaped by their choices. The farming they spread, the settlements they founded, the civilizations they seeded, all of it flows from them to us. And we will leave a world to people who cannot imagine what we cannot imagine. The choices we make now will shape environments and societies thousands of years in the future. The 8.2 kiloyear event was a turning point, a moment when the trajectory of human history shifted, not through any human intention, but through the blind forces of ice and water and climate. We live in another turning point. The choices we make about climate, about technology, about how we organize our societies will echo for millennia. We are the ancestors of the future. Will our descendants look back at us the way we look back at the survivors of the 8.2 kiloyear event? With curiosity about how we coped, with gratitude for what we preserved, or will they look back with anger at what we squandered, at warnings we ignored, at catastrophes we could have prevented but did not? The judgment of the future awaits. Subscribe if you want to explore more mysteries like this one. The collapse of Bronze Age civilizations, the fall of Rome, the Little Ice Age, the patterns of crisis and recovery that mark human history. For now, rest well. Tomorrow, you will wake in a world that is warmer than yesterday, part of a change that echoes what happened 8,000 years ago, but moves in the opposite direction. The ice is melting, the waters are rising, the currents are shifting. Whether we face our own 8.2 kiloyear event depends on choices we have not yet made. 8,200 years ago, the climate collapsed and erased civilizations. The survivors built new ones, and from those new civilizations eventually came you. Good night.